Then the angel said to Hagar, Sarai's servant, where have you come from and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress Sarai, she replied. 9.
The Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit yourself under her. Then the angel of the Lord said, I will multiply your descendants exceedingly, so that they shall not be counted for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are with child, and you shall bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction.
All right, and where are we now? Verse 12. Okay, verse 12 says, he shall be a wild man. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. Then she called the name of the Lord, who spoke to her, you are the God who sees. For she said, have I also here seen him who sees me? Therefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. Observe, it is between Kadesh and Bered. To Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. The Lord bless the reading of his word in the ears of the saints. Amen. And so this piece came to me exactly on New Year's Day when I did my Bible study. And I found it very interesting that the Lord took me into this chapter. And so for this, our first Sunday morning, I'd like us to reflect upon these 15 verses of Scripture that stands as a historic reality of where we come from and where we are today. And so we're grazing what we call the prodigious hills of the ancient texts, Genesis 16, 1 to 15. It's a text very dense with human failure, theological confusion, power abuse, and divine interruption. I will attempt to engage 3 characters who define this chapter. Number 1, we're going to engage Sarai. We're going to engage number 2, Abram, and we're going to engage Hagar. Notice Sarah, the Sarah that we know is spelled S-A-R-A-H. The Abram that we know is spelled A-B-R-A-H-A-M. No, Abraham, yeah. Until this chapter, God has not yet extended their names. Sarai means princess. Abram was called Abram at the time, but he's eventually going to be called Abraham. God extends his name. In Sarah's instance, the Lord changes her name from princess to the princess or the queen. And then, of course, we've got Hagar, the Egyptian maid of Sarah. And so in that deliberate order, I'm going to try and do justice to the narrative, the story, in its moral architecture. Only at the end will I turn to the angel of the Lord, who strikingly visits only one of the 3. And so when you look at Sarah's story, if you look at what happens here, in chapter 16, verse 1, Sarai comes to Abram. Sarai, Abram's wife, comes to Abram. Right? She had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maid servant whose name was Hagar, says the Bible. Then, verse 2 says, so Sarai said to Abram, so she now comes to Abram, and she says to him, see now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go into my maid, perhaps I shall obtain children by her. And Abram heeded the voice of Sarah. So Sarah is approximately 65 years old when this incident happens. It's at least 27 years. It defines 27 years of movement from the time that the Lord spoke to Abram in the land of Ur of the Chaldeans. Everybody knows that Abram was not originally a believer in the God that eventually reveals himself to him, but Abram was a moon worshipper. That's why the Lord, when he spoke to him about, look at the stars of the heaven. And only Abram could relate to that. That's why he was able to hear God and accept the invitation that God extends to him. God says to him, I'll make you a father of many nations. Your descendants will be like the stars of the canvas of heaven in that regard. And so God meets him there. And this occurs in Ur of the Chaldeans. Abram is about 75 years old at the time when the Lord encounters him, and we know that Sarai was 10 years younger than him. So in verse 2, we see that she comes to him and says to him, "See now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children." Now, it appears to be her complaining to her husband, but at the same time, she's accusing God. That's the first thing that we see with Sarah. Her conversation to Abram is an approach she's following on a decision that she has been dealing with. She has made an assessment. I'm without a child. I'm going to make a plan to deal with this problem because evidently nothing has happened so far. I'm going to create my own solution for my situation. I'm going to indulge in my own solution for my problem in that regard. But I can't do this by myself. I need to go to my authority, which is the husband that God has given unto her, or rather the husband that she had. Because in Ur of the Chaldeans, they were married already. But he becomes a follower of the God, the unknown God. So therefore, God must have then retrospectively blessed their union because they were already married or accepted them as a couple. When God predetermined before time that he will let his own seed come through them in that regard. That makes them a blessed couple from the beginning. And so what happens now is that she goes to Abram to get his sanctioning for a decision that she took by herself. She knows to go to her authority because he is the covering over her life. And she presents what she does. Okay, it's like in typical fashion. I'm going to have to approach this person. I don't know how they're going to deal with answering me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have to make sure I present a watertight case. And she decides the watertight case that she presents to Abram is that God, putting God into the equation. God restrained me from having a child. Herein lies the first rupture. Sarai accuses God instead of seeking God. She does not go to God. There's no evidence here in this chapter that Sarai cried unto the Lord. When I was sharing this thing with Mommy the first time when I got the revelation, it became clear to me that Sarai, unlike Hagar, unlike Hannah, for example, later on, cried to the Lord, also a barren woman. And then because of her crying, she came to her husband and said, "Pray to God that he may give us a child." Sarah doesn't do that. Sarai comes to Abram and tells Abram that God restrained me. And then she now wants Abram to agree with her. And as they come into this agreement, God stands central as the accused. She assigns causality to the Lord but denies him any petition. She doesn't go to him first and then come back and say, "I've called on the Lord and the Lord hasn't answered me." There's no recorded prayer, no altar, no intercession. Contrast this with Hannah, as I already said, that prayed, who wept, or even Rachel who cried, "Give me children or else I die." You have two examples of women that, different to Sarah, determined to do what? Determined to go to God and petition God on the state of their barrenness. Sarah does not do so. Sarah invents a plan, a solution. Sarah believes God enough to blame him, but not enough to trust him. This confusion births a plan. She decides that Abram, her husband, must go and sleep with Hagar, that she, Sarai, may obtain what we call a heritage or obtain children. Here's the problem now. Abram, in verse 2, agrees with Sarah. And so I'm saying I'm going to talk about Sarai, I'm going to talk about Abram, talk about Hagar, but I'm just sketching the story first now quickly. And so verse 3 becomes then very precise and intentional, because now Sarah says, Abram's wife takes Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband to be his wife. The text reminds us Sarah is Abram's wife. And I wonder why the New King James Version is so emphatic and clear about the fact that he never mentioned Sarai without putting the qualification or explanation of who she is, in stating that she is the wife of Abram. It's very important to appreciate that. And so it is here that I want to raise that this is no accident. Scripture insists that status, covenant, and accountability must not be forgotten, even as Sarai herself dismantles them. Now, there are three things that Sarah does that we are living with today in our world. Sarai becomes, in biblical record, the first person, because we're dealing with her now, the first person to introduce the subject of polygamy. Polygamy is the practice where a man has more than one wife. If you look at the history of Genesis, and you will find that Adam was the first man, but Adam as the first man only had one wife. Even after Adam's fall, there's no evidence in the Bible that Adam had more than one wife. So the first encounter that we have of more than one wife is now found in the Abrahamic episode, in the Abrahamic discourse. And that does not come because of the desire of a lustful man, that we can say it was Abram's desires to do this, but it was Sarai, the wife of a husband, that introduces the biblical record to the subject matter of polygamy. We would now see how polygamy runs through the text right up until the New Testament, right up until the end of the Old Testament, how many others had more than one. We know of David, we know of Solomon, they had concubines and all these things. But we have to trace this back to Sarai. She introduces what the world knows today in the 21st century, the subject matter of polygamy, wherein a man can have more than one wife in that regard. And so before this moment, Genesis knew no plural wives. Adam had one wife, Abram had one wife, from Ur to Canaan, until Sarai invented an alternate route to promise. And it's amazing how she is the one that introduces this, and we sit today with that reality in our society. The second thing that Sarai does with the plan that she's crafting, she's going to introduce to us what we call surrogacy or surrogate motherhood. She becomes the first woman or person to put together a plan in which she says, I'm barren, but I'm going to allow my husband to go and sleep with my servant. And when he sleeps with my servant, then that which is produced from them being together will become my child. There's a bit of craziness in that, because it can never really be your child from the point of view that you didn't birth the child. It can be your child, the child of your husband, which you embrace as your child because you share with him marriage in that regard. And so she introduces us to surrogacy centuries before science would formalize it. But unlike modern ethical debates, the surrogacy is rooted in ownership, coercion, and denial of personhood. So if you understand what is going on with Sarah's mind, her plan, if you unpack the plan, we know today about the scientific practice of surrogacy, where a couple that can't produce children can go and seek some medical help, and eventually they can find someone who will be a surrogate mother, in which the sperm of the husband would be injected or injected into that womb, and that womb would produce a child, and that woman will carry the child, and eventually the child will become the family of the egg of the mother. Yes, exactly. The egg, in fact, the difference, the egg of the mother, of the actual mother, is taken, and then it's combined with the father's sperm, and then the womb becomes the place, the embryo. Exactly, okay. Right. And so Sarah introduces us to a form of surrogate motherhood as a concept that now we know in different shapes and sizes, but we can accredit that as part of her legacy that she has bequeathed us. The third thing, which is a more troubling aspect that she does, is what I would call institutional rape or institutionalized rape. Sarai abuses the power asymmetry where she finds herself between mistress and slave. She is in control of Hagar's life. Hagar is a maid. Hagar is the one that receives from her instructions. So there is no evidence in this biblical record here that Hagar ever agreed to or consented to go and sleep with Abram. And so it means we then have to accept that this happened against her own wish and will. Now, it's important to appreciate that slaves belong to their owners. No question about that. It's important to appreciate that while slaves belong to their owners, that those slaves were not exempted from certain types of rights. For example, a man could not just walk in on a bunch of naked women because they are slaves. You have to respect, in a sense, their privacy. And therefore, to then bring this woman to Abram in that regard and present her to Abram, for Abram to then consummate with her in that regard what we would call marriage, in producing a child, was, without the permission of Hagar, constitutes for me institutionalized rape in that regard. Abram's sexual act with Hagar under these conditions constitutes, in my understanding, institutionalized rape, sanctioned by a household authority and insulated by custom and executed without agency. That means Hagar had no say. And so when we look at Sarah's one act, we see three troublesome aspects that gets introduced into our narrative, which is our history now, and what we are dealing with in the 21st century. So in one act, Sarai accuses God. Sarai accuses eventually Hagar. You will later on see she accuses Abram because she says, my wrong be upon you. She exploits power. She introduces polygamy. She invents surrogacy. And she authorizes rape. And, troublesome, she demotes herself. Because what she does is the following. She takes Hagar to her husband and she makes Hagar the wife of Abram. That act is an act of demotion. I was saying to Mommy when I was discussing this thing, not only did she just instruct Hagar to go there, but she almost prepared Hagar to go and be of use for that particular exercise with Abram. And so that means that she must have said to her, use this makeup, use this perfume, whatever clothing she needed to wear, because she needed to present Hagar in that sense. In fact, a further thought I'm having is that it couldn't have been an accident for Sarah to choose Hagar in particular, because Hagar we know was an Egyptian young girl. We'll talk, not a young girl, an Egyptian woman in that regard. But Sarah must have looked at the possibilities of what this child that will be birthed would look like. Am I correct? Because she then must have said, of all the servants around, maybe Hagar is the best suited. So that if in time to come the child is now born and herself and Abram would have this child in their presence, people would not obviously discern that this is not of their production in that regard. And so her choice for Hagar, in that sense, speaks in my mind two things that has to do with her preparing Hagar for this episode. On the other hand, I'd like to talk about Abram at the same time, instance about this on this issue, and that is that we don't know and we can't guess and we can't surmise and nor can we assume that Abram necessarily wanted Hagar. But we also can't deny that when Hagar's name came up, that Abram said, no, this can't happen. So it means that we can only deduce that there was an agreement of some sort that worked for Abram himself in that regard. Less to do with the agenda of what Sarai produced or presented to him, but also, and in line with his desire to have this promise met in that regard. And so now, by making Hagar Abram's wife, this is what Sarah does, she replaces herself. Now look at the implications of this decision that Sarah makes. So now she replaces herself as a wife of Abram, maybe the first wife, but Abram having another wife. But it gets more problematic because now, not only is she becoming the second wife, is she introducing a second wife for Abram, but she at the same time is eternalizing herself as the second mother only, the second woman only that will produce a child. So the order of God is not displaced. The order of God at best is delayed. So what is happening is God had purpose. When God told Abram, God said to Abram, I will make you the father of many nations. Your descendants will be this vast, you won't be able to count them. They'll be like the stars of the heaven. That's the promise that God made to Abram in Ur of the Chaldeans, a 75-year-old man. And that promise stands. So all along, as Abram is sojourning into the destiny and land that God has orchestrated for him, he makes sacrifices in different places. For example, in Bethel, in Kadesh Barnea, where he calls unto the Lord, I think in Peniel, I'm not even sure. But he makes many, many sacrifices along the way towards this promise that God has made. This promise that God has made has not yet manifested physically. But everybody knows that when God says something, you can take it to the bank. It's done. It will just happen in the right time. It may not happen in the appointed time in our understanding, but it will happen within the appointed time of the heavenly council in that regard. It's a done deal. And so what Sarah does with this act, in which she wants to now help God, she eternalizes herself as only the second woman that ever will now fall pregnant to Abram. Are you with me? Because you can't undo this stuff. You will recall that in the episode where, who was it that came for the blessing? Was it Manasseh and Ephraim? Was it also Jacob, right? And then the other one was had to do with Esau and Jacob, the blessing, because the one taking away the birthright of the other, right? And in the case of Manasseh and Ephraim again, we have a situation where the hands were crossed so that the secondborn got the blessing and the firstborn didn't get the blessing. And so this thing with God about being first is major. And so this act of Sarai alters that in the sense, in that regard. It's still going to happen. God's going to keep his word, right? Interesting enough, when Hagar produces the child, Abram is 86 years old. It's still 14 years before he's going to become the father of Isaac, which will be born from the womb of Sarah, a 90-year-old woman in that regard. So for 14 years, Sarah had to deal with the consequences of her choice that she had made, because she cannot now claim that she's the first woman to have born. Then verse 5 says, in verse 5, in fact, one decision made in panic produces consequences no apology can undo. Verse 5 exposes her moral collapse. My wrong be upon you. First, Sarai externalizes guilt, blaming Abram for a plan she authored. Second, she indicts him for consequences that she engineered. So she says, it's on you. Now watch how she does it. She accuses God first. Then she accuses Hagar because Hagar reacted a certain way towards her. When Hagar found out that she was pregnant, Hagar began to despise her. Now she's accusing who? She's accusing Abram, right? And saying, even though I came with the plan, your approval of the plan means that you are a part engineer of this plan. This is the tragedy of unrepentant power. It always seeks an scapegoat. Now let's turn. We've now dealt with Sarah. Let's turn to the second character. The second character here, which should have really been the first character, is Abram. And for me, Abram is explained within this chapter 16 in 3 words. It's abdication, silence, and moral failure. If Sarai's failure is severe, in my opinion, Abram's contribution is catastrophic. This is the man who heard God's voice in Ur of the Chaldeans, who trusted an unseen future, who built altars and received covenantal promises. Yet here in chapter 16, he trades the voice of God for the voice of Sarai. That's the fundamental problem that Abram presents to us. Abram presents those who trade the voice of God to the voice of their wives, the voice of those that they love. And it can happen in marriage, it can happen in relationships, it can happen in business, that because we love the particular person so much, we are willing to do what? To trade the promise of God. We are willing to compromise, we are willing to contaminate that which God had given us. God helps us that none of us fall within that trap. Yet he trades the voice of God for the voice of Sarai. Abram does not question the plan. And I have a problem with the fact that a plan is presented to Abram. A very intimate and very serious plan. And he has no presence of mind to engage the plan. He does not even tell Sarah, can we go pray about this? There we see the lack of leadership on his part. He does not protect Hagar from the abuse that will be served on her when Sarah's anger is released against her. He does not lead Sarah in any sense here. For the occasion that Sarai comes to him, Abram is absent in leading Sarai in any true leadership the way that God ordained it. And so what does this mean? This means that leadership abdication becomes complicit. You become complicity in this regard. So you cannot accuse Sarai without accusing Abram in that regard. As the owner of the slave, because the slave owner, right, owns the slave. Then he assigns from that slaves for his wife and slaves for his children. maids for his wife. So you can't even say that Hagar belonged to Sarai from the onset. You can only say that Hagar belonged to the Abrahamic household as a maid, and she was assigned. Somebody had to then assign her to become the what? The servant of Sarai. And that assignment must have come from Abram. And so Abram had a duty, in my understanding, to protect even the servant's vulnerability, even from himself. Instead, he participates in her violation. The worst still, Abram eternalizes the disorder by conceding and accepting that Ishmael becomes the firstborn versus Isaac, the promised son, who becomes the secondborn. You have to place that at the foot of Abram. Even though Sarai came with a plan, Abram should have said to her, Sarai, have you lost your mind? Have you gone crazy? Because God is no man that you would lie. The God that has been with us all this time, he will keep his promise. But every time when a man does not take care of his wife, does not lead his wife, that woman will lead him in a different way if she does not hear from God. The first thing Abram should have done was to ask Sarai, did you ask God about this? But besides even asking God, and he should have said to her, I will ask the Lord if this is the plan. He hasn't done any of that. He accepts the plan as it is. And you know how it works in these structures. Once the plan has been submitted and approved, even remember in the case of Esther, when Haman went to present to the king the creed that would annihilate all the Jews at the time. Once the creed has been given, the king can't go back on his word. And so the importance here is Sarai understands how to manipulate the love of Abram so that she can get her way. And once Abram approves it now, she has earned the right to accuse him even if it goes wrong. Divine order is not erased, but it is delayed, complicated, and scarred. When Sarai later mistreats Hagar, Abram says, indeed your maid is in your hand. Do to her as you please. Now here's a problem here. By the time Hagar, and we'll deal with her just now, is now pregnant and it's now known that she's pregnant, she becomes cocky and arrogant towards Sarai. She should not have done that. We will deal with that now. But here's my problem. When Sarai becomes aware of Hagar's attitude towards her, she goes back to Abram. This time she goes and complains to Abram, and she talks about my wrong be upon you, which means we are together in this thing. Are you with me in that regard? It's almost like what Adam said, the woman that thou hast given me, this apple, or whatever fruit it was. So there's an agreement in that regard. But now, Abram should have had the presence of mind to say, woman, have you lost your mind? Do you now know that Hagar, before she showed up in my room to sleep with, right, was a maid? Now that she has conceived, she is holding the heir within her loins. So from that point of view, if Abram was present in mind, he would have rebuked his wife, Sarai, to say to her, don't you understand that we have gone through that bus stop now? The train has left that station. She is now physically part of this family. She is now part of that. She's holding the actual firstborn because you're not pregnant yet. He doesn't do so. And so he rather says to Sarai, your maid is in your hand. And this sounds, and do whatever you want to please to her. This sounds like he has delegated power. But this is bad delegation because it would have been it's problematic because what is already on the inside of Hagar is the seed of a promise. And you can't get away from that. And so the Hebrew word for the word, now what happens is that Sarai starts dealing with Hagar on the strength and the authority of Abram. She starts dealing with Hagar harshly. The word harshly is the word anah. The same word used to describe the affliction the Israelites suffered in Egypt. So you can imagine what's going on here now. And if I can explain this, it means to crush, to humiliate, and to subjugate you. It means you bring affliction upon this person. So in typical sense, what Sarai was now doing to Hagar was, number one, she would ration the portions of her morsels, what she was going to eat. She, knowing this woman is pregnant, would now, instead of giving a loaf of bread, would give her half a loaf of bread or a quarter. She would make her work longer hours, knowing she's pregnant. She would make her do tougher assignments, tougher jobs in that regard, because she's trying to punish her because her ego has been hurt. Now, to show you that Sarai doesn't care about this child, because mommy would know that every single woman that ever falls pregnant, from the day of pregnancy until the last day that child is born, that woman's life is in danger. That child's life is in danger. That means in any of the trimesters, there can be a complication, there can be a problem that can lead to death of mother and child. And so if you now, that's why when you go to the doctor after you're pregnant, when you discovered you're pregnant, the doctor changes your diet, changes the way the things you do. If you were smoking, he will tell you stop smoking because it'll have an effect on the child. If you were working hardcore labor, picking up heavy things, they will now say you can't do so. You must rest your feet up this way. A whole lot of things happen once you're pregnant. Sarai couldn't care. So the question then becomes, how sincere was Sarai about this pregnancy? If she could not care to exert on the life and on the person, on the being of Sarai what she did by treating her harshly, she couldn't really have cared for this child. So silence in the face of abuse on both the part of Abram is not neutrality, it is endorsement. Abram was part of this. And so now we understand that between Abram and Sarah, we see these two characters having been part of what we would call the delay of God's plan, the intervention to try and help God, the abdication of responsibility, not showing any leadership, and also at the same time on Sarah's part, the abuse of what I would call the relationship that she shares with Abram for her own benefit, for her own immediate solution to replace what God has in store or to help God. That turns us to the third character called Hagar. We don't know much about Hagar. We know that she was an Egyptian slave. We don't know how old she was. We don't know how long she's been with the Abrahamic household. We don't know much about her. But what we do know is that we know her name and we know her status and where she came from. And so now her mistress, after she had fallen pregnant, she then began to despise her mistress. Verse 4 talks about that. And that Hebrew word despise there is the word kalal, spelled Q-A-L-A-L. Q-A-L-A-L. Meaning to treat lightly, to diminish, to hold in contempt. That means where before Sarah would give her an instruction to do a specific thing, she would roll up her lips now and said, why don't you do it yourself? Or why don't you tell so-and-so to do it? That's what happened. What Hagar, her pregnancy brought her to the place where she felt she is now replacing the first wife. And there's an interesting lesson there for us all to learn, even though some of us never will be pregnant physically. But Hagar's sin is not conception, but arrogance. Pregnancy becomes entitlement. She assumed the status has shifted permanently. Let this be said plainly. Pregnancy does not equal replacement. Fruitfulness does not cancel order. God's purposes are not shortcuts to arrogance. And so the fact that you're pregnant doesn't mean to say you are now a mother. The fact that you're pregnant, because you're still carrying this child. The fact that you're pregnant and show potential does not mean that you can now usurp authority and go before someone. It's almost like somebody who in the church discovers that they can preach also, and now they want to abuse the pastor's authority to try and say he preaches better than the pastor. It's the same kind of thing. Her mistreatment becomes unbearable and she eventually flees, pregnant, vulnerable, and she stumbles into the wilderness. We don't know where she's going either in this regard. And so we're having now looked at these three characters of people that we are dealing with, Sarai, Abram, and Hagar. Each of us can reflect. We don't know. We have to determine where do we fit. Am I a Sarai that is trying to help God's plan? Am I an Abram who abdicates my responsibility and don't protect the vulnerable? Am I an Abram who loves my wife more than I love God? Am I a Sarai who manipulates things according to my own desires and craft plans without even consulting God? Am I a Sarai who is now going to deal harshly with the woman that I have chosen to go and become my wife in replacement in that regard? Am I a Sarah who doesn't care about the child that is being carried right now by Hagar in that regard? These are the things we have to ask ourselves. But then also we can ask ourselves, are we the Hagar type? Are we the type of Hagar that would now, because of our pregnancy, because of what God gave us in infancy, we now act as if we are the cat's whiskers. We know everything, and we become disrespectful towards the order. We become disrespectful towards the structure and the governance of the household, because she remained a servant of Sarai, notwithstanding the fact that all of this had transpired. Her mistreatment becomes unbearable, and she flees, pregnant, vulnerable, and alone. She is somewhere at a spring in the wilderness. Now, I don't know, when you flee from a household, you don't take too much with you. It gets more complicated when you flee and you're pregnant, because you need care, you need support, you need medical attention.